White cop calls black man a monkey and discovers he's the new police chief. Hello, Story Atelier family. Welcome back to the place where every tale takes you on a journey you'll never forget. Today, we have a gripping story of power, corruption, and justice, one that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Imagine a man with integrity stepping into a system plagued by deceit. A man who refuses to stand down in the face of deep-rooted corruption. In tonight's episode, we follow Chief Thomas Reed, who uncovers a dangerous web of betrayal within his own police department. What starts as a routine traffic stop spirals into a battle against injustice, where secrets are exposed and lives are changed forever. Will integrity prevail, or will the system swallow him whole? Stay tuned as we dive into this riveting tale, The Fall of Corruption. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. The night was eerily quiet, with only the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves to disturb the silence. Officer Blake Matthews sat in his patrol car, the engine idling softly. His shift had been uneventful, and the drowsiness of routine had begun to seep into his mind. Suddenly, headlights pierced the dark, and a sleek black sedan sped past, just over the speed limit. Blake's instincts kicked in. Flipping on the siren, he pursued the vehicle, pulling it over a few miles down a deserted stretch of road. He adjusted his hat, checked his belt, and strode confidently toward the driver's side window. License and registration, Blake barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Inside the car, Thomas Reed, a tall, composed black man in his mid-40s, calmly rolled down the window. He handed over the documents without a word, his face unreadable. "You in a hurry tonight?" Blake asked, scanning the license with a smirk, his eyes flicking back to Thomas as if searching for trouble. "No, officer, just heading home," Thomas replied, his voice steady but firm. Blake frowned, stepping back to survey the car. The man's demeanor annoyed him, a quiet confidence that Blake found almost taunting. Something about Thomas made him feel undermined, though he couldn't place why. "Where exactly is home?" Blake pressed, his voice growing colder. "In the city," Thomas said simply, not offering more. Blake's irritation grew. "You look like someone who's hiding something," he muttered, the venom in his voice unmistakable. Then, almost as if testing the waters, he sneered, "What are you, a big shot or something? Or just another monkey trying to outsmart the system?" The insult hung in the air like a thunderclap, the quiet around them turning deafening. Thomas didn't flinch. His calm demeanor was unshaken, but his gaze hardened, locking onto Blake's with a quiet intensity. "You're going to regret that," Thomas said softly, his tone so measured it sent a chill down Blake's spine. Blake laughed, though the sound was forced. "Oh yeah, and why's that?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, leather badge holder. With deliberate precision, he flipped it open and placed it on the hood of the car. The words gleamed under the streetlight, "Chief of Police Thomas Reed." Blake's face drained of color. His smirk vanished, replaced by a stunned, slack-jawed silence. "Looks like I'm not just another man on the street," Thomas said, his voice now edged with authority. Blake stumbled over his words, trying to recover his composure, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The man he had insulted and belittled was now his superior, the ultimate authority in the department he served. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Thomas stepped back, crossing his arms. "What's your name, officer?" "Blake Matthews." Blake stammered. "Well, Officer Matthews," Thomas said, his voice steady but unmistakably commanding. "Let's see how well you handle accountability." Blake's confidence crumbled further as Thomas pulled out his phone and began recording. The camera's red light blinked ominously, a silent witness to the unfolding scene. "Anything else you'd like to say?" Thomas asked, his question more of a challenge than an invitation. Blake swallowed hard, but his silence spoke volumes. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and Blake Matthews was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Blake Matthews stood frozen, his mind racing but offering no escape. The badge on the hood of Thomas Reed's car gleamed under the pale streetlight, mocking him with its authority. He had just insulted his boss. No, not just his boss, but the chief of police, and there was no undoing it. Thomas's calm demeanor made the moment all the more terrifying. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse, didn't demand an apology. Instead, he leaned casually against his car, his phone still recording, the faint red light a constant reminder that every second of this exchange was being documented. "Step back, Officer Matthews," Thomas instructed, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. Blake stumbled backward, his hands twitching nervously by his sides. The arrogance he had carried minutes earlier evaporated into pure panic. "You seem awfully quiet now," Thomas continued, his tone still calm, almost conversational. "Not the same energy as when you were calling me names." Blake opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. He felt the weight of Thomas's gaze, sharp and unrelenting. "You searched my car," Thomas stated, gesturing toward the open doors and scattered contents Blake had rifled through moments earlier. "Found anything illegal? Anything at all to justify your behavior?" Blake shook his head, the lump in his throat making it impossible to respond verbally. "Then tell me, Officer Matthews," Thomas said, stepping closer, his presence towering. "Why the search? Why the insults? Why the blatant abuse of power?" Blake's mouth finally worked. I didn't mean what?" Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting through Blake's stammering like a blade. "Didn't mean to racially profile me. Didn't mean to use a slur. Or didn't mean to get caught." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's mind raced for an excuse, a justification, anything that might mitigate the disaster unfolding before him. But he found nothing. "Officer Matthews," Thomas said, his tone now colder, "you've violated not only the trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer but also the basic principles of decency and justice. Do you even understand the gravity of your actions?" Blake finally managed to speak. I was just doing my job. "Sir, I thought." "You thought," Thomas repeated, cutting him off. "You thought this was your job. To demean and humiliate people. To abuse the authority given to you by the people of this city." Blake's chest tightened as he realized he was sinking deeper with every word. Thomas straightened, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to call for backup. Right now." "Backup?" Blake echoed, his voice trembling. "Yes," Thomas said, "because this scene needs witnesses. I want your colleagues to see how accountability works. Now, call for backup." Blake hesitated for a moment too long. "That wasn't a request," Thomas added sharply, with trembling hands. Blake reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he croaked, "requesting backup on Route 17. Immediate assistance needed." "Copy that, Officer Matthews. Units en route," came the response. The wait felt like an eternity. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Thomas and the road, where the flashing lights of approaching squad cars finally appeared. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and 4 officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. "What's going on here?" asked Officer Hernandez. a no-nonsense cop with years of experience etched into her lined face. "Evening, officers." Thomas greeted them, stepping forward. He gestured toward Blake. "Your colleague here decided to racially profile me, search my vehicle without cause, and verbally assault me. I'm Chief Thomas Reed." The officers froze, their eyes darting between Thomas and Blake. The revelation hit them like a sledgehammer. "Chief," Hernandez stammered. "That's correct," Thomas confirmed, pulling out his badge again for emphasis. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Blake looked ready to faint. "I want Officer Matthews placed on suspension, effective immediately," Thomas said, his tone firm. "He is to hand over his badge and weapon and will be escorted to the precinct for further investigation." The officers hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "Now," Thomas snapped. Hernandez recovered first. "Yes, Chief," she said, turning to Blake. "Matthews, hand it over." Blake's face turned ghostly pale. His hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and holster, placing them in Hernandez's outstretched hands. "Chief Reed, Blake began, his voice weak, but Thomas raised a hand to silence him. "Save it," Thomas said, his voice ice cold. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself during the investigation." As the officers led Blake to one of the squad cars, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. The authority he had once wielded was gone, stripped away in a matter of minutes. Thomas watched as the car door slammed shut, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he stood still, staring after the vehicle as it disappeared down the road. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Thomas Reed stood on the deserted stretch of Route 17. The faint red and blue lights of the squad cars fading into the distance. The cool night breeze brushed against his face, but his mind burned with intensity. Tonight wasn't just about putting Officer Blake Matthews in his place, it was about peeling back the layers of a broken system. He returned to his car, straightened his suit, and dialed a number on his phone. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. "Chief Reed," said Deputy Commissioner Harold Simmons, his voice laced with curiosity. "What's going on? It's late. I need an internal affairs team at the station by sunrise." Thomas said bluntly, "I've encountered a situation that demands immediate attention. No delays." There was a pause. "Is this about Matthews?" Simmons asked. "You already know about him," Thomas replied, his tone sharp. "I've heard rumors," Simmons admitted, "but nothing substantial. Should I be concerned?" "More than concerned," Thomas said. "I'll fill you in when I get to the precinct. Prepare for a full audit." Thomas ended the call and slid back into his car. As he drove toward the station, his mind replayed the events of the night. Blake's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a larger issue within the department. A culture of unchecked power and prejudice that had festered for too long. The precinct was quiet when Thomas arrived, save for a few night shift officers who snapped to attention as he walked through the door. His presence was commanding, his movements purposeful. Inside his office, Thomas found a stack of personnel files already waiting for him. His assistant, Linda Carson, had anticipated his request. "Thought you might need these," Linda said, her tone professional but warm. "Thanks, Linda," Thomas said, giving her a brief nod. "Anything else?" she asked, sensing the tension in the air. Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Just hold my calls. Tonight's going to be a long one." As Linda left, Thomas opened Blake Matthews's file. What he saw confirmed his suspicions: multiple complaints of misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias, all swept under the rug. Each complaint had been labeled unsubstantiated, Signed off by the same supervisor, Captain Richard Hayes. Hayes, Thomas muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Blake Matthews sat in the interrogation room, his hands fidgeting on the cold metal table. He had been given no chance to change out of his uniform, and the once pristine badge of authority now felt like a scarlet letter on his chest. The door opened, and Officer Hernandez walked in, carrying a clipboard. She sat down across from him, her expression unreadable. "Matthews," she began, her tone clipped, "this is your opportunity to cooperate. Tell us everything, every incident, every report you think might come up in the investigation." Blake's jaw tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Hernandez leaned forward. "Let me make something clear. Chief Reed is not the kind of man you can bluff or intimidate. He's already digging through your file. And trust me, it doesn't look good. So I'll ask you again, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Blake hesitated. He thought of Hayes, his mentor and protector within the department, and the unspoken rule to never expose their own. "I want my lawyer," Blake finally said, crossing his arms. Hernandez smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Suit yourself. But don't think for a second that this ends here." Back in his office, Thomas had moved on to Hayes's file. As he read, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Hayes had been in his position for over a decade, overseeing offices with records marred by complaints. Yet somehow, none of those complaints ever escalated. Thomas reached for his phone again. This time, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "James Crawford." The voice answered on the other end. "James, it's Thomas Reed," he said. "Chief Reed," James replied, his tone immediately serious. "What can I do for you?" "I need a favor," Thomas said. "I'm dealing with systemic corruption in my precinct. I need someone outside the department who can dig where I can't." "Think you're up for the challenge?" There was a brief pause. "You know I've been waiting for a case like this," James said. "Good," Thomas said. "Meet me at the station in an hour." By the time James Crawford arrived, the tension in the precinct was palpable. Officers whispered among themselves, their glances darting nervously toward Thomas's office. The arrival of an outsider only heightened the unease. James, a private investigator with a reputation for uncovering deep-seated corruption, strode into Thomas's office with a confidence that matched the chief's. "You've got a mess on your hands," James said after a brief handshake. "That's an understatement," Thomas replied, sliding the files across the desk. James flipped through them, his sharp eyes scanning each page. "Hayes is your linchpin," he said. "Take him down, and the whole structure collapses." "That's the plan," Thomas said, "but I need hard evidence, something that ties him directly to the cover-ups." James nodded, a sly grin forming. "Leave that to me." As James left to begin his investigation, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back. The system had protected men like Hayes and Matthews for too long. It was time to dismantle it piece by piece. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when James Crawford arrived at the precinct again, carrying a manila folder bulging with documents. His sharp suit and polished demeanor made him stand out among the groggy officers preparing for their shifts. He headed straight for Thomas Reed's office, nodding curtly to Linda Carson, who let him through without a word. Thomas sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files and a large cup of untouched coffee. He looked up as James entered, his expression expectant but weary. "What have you got?" Thomas asked, cutting straight to the point. James placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing pages of financial records, emails, and photographs. Hayes isn't just protecting bad cops, James began, his tone grave. He's running a full-scale operation. Bribes, kickbacks, intimidation. He's been using his position to shield corrupt officers and profit off their actions. Thomas leaned forward, his brows furrowing. Give me specifics. James pulled out a page and placed it on top. This is a list of companies that have made donations to the precinct's discretionary fund over the years. Look closer, these aren't donations. They're payouts for looking the other way on everything from illegal construction to smuggling operations. Thomas clenched his jaw. And Hayes? James smirked, pulling out another document. He's the gatekeeper. Nothing moves without his approval. He's also been redirecting funds meant for community programs into dummy accounts. The trail leads straight to him. Do we have enough to make an arrest? Thomas asked, his tone sharp. Almost. James said, but we need one more thing, someone from inside to corroborate this. A witness who can tie Hayes to the crimes directly. Thomas exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. That's a tall order. Most of these officers are either complicit or too scared to speak out. Then we make them talk. James replied, his voice firm. The tension in the precinct was palpable as Thomas and James began their quiet probe. Officers whispered in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the chief's office. The unease spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before Captain Richard Hayes himself showed up, his imposing figure filling the hallway as he marched toward Thomas's office. Hayes knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Chief," Hayes said, his tone deceptively casual. "Heard you've been busy." Thomas looked up from his desk, his face unreadable. "Morning, Captain. Something on your mind?" Hayes chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Just wondering what's got everyone so jumpy." "Word is, you're stirring the pot." Thomas met Hayes's gaze without flinching. "Transparency makes some people nervous. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Hayes's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Just making sure you're not wasting time chasing shadows." "Thanks for your concern," Thomas said, his tone dismissive. Hayes lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned and left. James, who had been observing from the corner of the office, spoke once Hayes was out of earshot. "He knows you're onto him." "Good," Thomas said. "Let him sweat." Later that evening, James called Thomas with a breakthrough. "I've got a lead," he said. "One of Hayes's lieutenants, Officer Derek Morgan, is on the fence. He's been part of Hayes's network but has a clean enough record to flip if we push him." "Set up a meeting," Thomas said. James arranged for Morgan to meet them at a diner on the outskirts of town. Away from prying eyes, Morgan arrived late, his face pale and his hands twitching nervously. "You sure this is safe?" Morgan asked, sliding into the booth across from Thomas and James. "It's as safe as it gets," James replied. Thomas leaned forward. "We know Hayes is running a racket. And we know you've been involved. What we need is your cooperation to bring him down." Morgan swallowed hard. "You don't understand. Hayes doesn't just run this precinct, he controls everything. If I talk, I'm a dead man. You're already in danger," Thomas said bluntly. "If we take Hayes down, his whole operation crumbles. If you stay silent, you'll go down with him." Morgan's eyes darted around the diner, his paranoia evident. "I've got a family," he whispered, "and they deserve better than this." Thomas said, "Help us, and I'll make sure they're protected." After a long pause, Morgan nodded. Okay, I'll do it, but you'd better keep your word. The next day, Morgan provided key information, meeting spots, aliases, and the names of other officers involved. Armed with this intel, James dug deeper, uncovering a series of encrypted messages between Hayes and local businessmen. By nightfall, Thomas had everything he needed. He issued a warrant for Hayes's arrest, coordinating with internal affairs to execute it discreetly. The precinct was buzzing with activity when the officers arrived to arrest Hayes. The captain was in his office, reviewing paperwork, when the door burst open, and a team of officers swarmed in. Richard Hayes, Thomas announced, stepping forward. You're under arrest for corruption, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Hayes's face twisted with rage. You're making a big mistake. Read, he shouted as the officers cuffed him. The only mistake, Thomas said coldly, was thinking you were untouchable. As Hayes was led away, the precinct fell silent. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. The reign of corruption was over, but the battle for reform was just beginning. The arrest of Captain Richard Hayes sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officers whispered in hushed tones, some in disbelief, others in fear of what might come next. Hayes had been the cornerstone of their operation for years, a figure both feared and respected. Now, he was just another criminal being processed in the same system he had exploited. Thomas Reed stood in the observation room of the interrogation wing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched Hayes through the two-way mirror. Hayes sat at the steel table, his once commanding demeanor replaced by a simmering rage. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through a stack of documents, while an internal affairs officer prepared to begin questioning. James Crawford entered the observation room, a satisfied grin on his face. He's rattled, James said. Men like Hayes don't handle losing control very well. Thomas nodded but didn't look away. He's going to fight this. He'll deny, deflect, and drag every officer he can down with him. James leaned against the wall, his grin fading. That's why we need Morgan to hold his ground. If Hayes thinks his network is crumbling, he'll turn desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. Across the precinct, Officer Derek Morgan sat in a conference room, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door every few seconds. Linda Carson sat across from him, her voice calm and steady as she went over his testimony. You're doing the right thing, Officer Morgan, Linda assured him. This is your chance to help clean up this department. Morgan nodded weakly. I just hope I live to see it. You will, Linda said firmly. We've taken every precaution. Hayes won't touch you or your family. Just as she finished, Thomas entered the room. He placed a hand on Morgan's shoulder. You've shown courage tonight, Thomas said. That's what this department needs more of. People willing to stand up for what's right. Morgan looked up at Thomas, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. Thank you, Chief. Hours later, the precinct was abuzz as Hayes's interrogation reached a boiling point. Internal Affairs had presented mountains of evidence, financial records, testimony from Morgan, and encrypted messages decrypted by James. Hayes's lawyer tried to poke holes in the case, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. When Hayes finally spoke, it wasn't to deny the charges, it was to issue a veiled threat. You think this ends with me? Hayes snarled. You think you're some kind of hero? Read, there are more like me out there, and they'll eat you alive. Thomas stepped into the room, his presence silencing everyone. He leaned over the table, meeting Hayes's glare with an unflinching stare. Let them come, Thomas said coldly. I'll take him down one by one. just like I took you down." Hayes's smirk faltered, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. The fallout from Hayes's arrest was swift and far-reaching. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation into the precinct, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Hayes. Several officers resigned in disgrace, while others faced suspension or criminal charges. The public, initially skeptical of Thomas Reed's appointment as chief, began to see him as a beacon of hope for a department long plagued by scandal. Thomas stood at the podium during a press conference, facing a sea of reporters and flashing cameras. His voice was steady and resolute as he addressed the crowd. "This department has failed the people of this city for far too long," Thomas said. "Tonight, we begin the hard work of rebuilding trust, accountability, and justice. There will be no room for corruption, no tolerance for abuse of power. To the people of this city, I promise you this: we will be better." The crowd erupted into applause, but Thomas's expression remained somber. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but he was ready for the challenge. That night, as the precinct quieted and officers returned to their duties, Thomas sat alone in his office. The files and reports that once cluttered his desk were gone, replaced by a single piece of paper, a draft of the new code of conduct he planned to implement. James entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the desk and sat down across from Thomas. "You did it," James said. "You brought the hammer down." Thomas shook his head. "This isn't the end. It's just the first step." James raised his cup in a mock toast. "To many more steps." Then, Thomas chuckled softly and clinked his cup against James's. "To many more steps." As James left, Thomas looked out the window, the city's lights twinkling against the dark sky. He thought of the officers who had stood by him, the citizens who deserved better, and the battles still to come. He wasn't just a man in a uniform, he was a force for change. And he wouldn't stop until the system he served truly served everyone. For the first time in years, Thomas felt hope, not just for himself, but for the city he had sworn to protect. And so, with determination and unwavering integrity, Chief Thomas Reed took his stand, proving that justice isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about holding those in power accountable. His journey reminds us that real change requires courage, resilience, and the belief that no one is above the law. But this story doesn't end here. It's a call to action, for all of us, to stand up against corruption, fight for fairness, and demand better from the systems that are meant to serve us. Here at the Story Atelier, we believe stories like these inspire us to think critically, act justly, and, most importantly, never lose hope in the power of change. If you enjoyed today's story and want to see more compelling tales that challenge, inspire, and entertain, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And if you haven't already, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode from the Story Atelier. Your support helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay curious, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next story.